What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Saturday. You know what time it is. Time to get into the wide receiver starts and sits heading into Week 10. You don't need me to tell you, but the fantasy playoffs are right around the corner, so making sure we perform our best at this point of the season is going to be extremely important. It, of course, is no help. We do have 4 teams once again out on bye, but thankfully, starting next week, Week 11, only 2 teams are out on bye. Same thing as well for Week 12, so the player pool we'll have to choose from is going to be much larger in the coming weeks. As you guys know, in this video, I'm going through each matchup, letting you know how we overall feel about each player, the range in which we have them ranked. So by the end of it, you should know which wide receiver we would start over the next, but if you're ever unsure, you know all you have to do is go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. There you can access our most up-to-date rankings, and the link for that is in the description box below. While you're on your way to check those out, be sure to like the video. As you know, it greatly helps us out in growing the channel, so those of you that do hit the like button, just know we greatly appreciate it. With that being said though, it's time to hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was among running backs, Najee Harris currently leads the league with 19 targets in a single game. Yesterday's question was which running back ranks second just behind him, and the correct answer was actually Michael Carter. Congratulations to Lumpnubs, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at ColinGrace15. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which wide receiver with at least 35 receptions is currently leading the league in the area of expected yards after catch over expectation? Once again, that's which wide receiver in 2021 is currently leading the position in the area of yards after catch over expectation. They do have to have a minimum of at least 35 receptions. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, now without further ado, let's hop right into it, and as per usual, we'll begin with touching on the teams that are on bye this week. As I had mentioned earlier, it is going to be 4 teams on bye this week: New York Giants, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Houston Texans, and the Chicago Bears. Now, not as many star-studded wide receivers are going to be out this week, at least not like last week where we were without the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Seattle Seahawks, players like DK Metcalf, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, but I'm sure some of you are feeling it. Brandon Cooks, he won't be available this week. Also, Jamar Chase, one of the league's best receivers this season. There's also T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, Kadarius Toney, and when you couple that with the amount of injuries that we're all currently facing this season, this week certainly is not going to be the easiest when deciding on who we're going to start or sit. Looking into our first matchup though, we have the Buffalo Bills on the road against the New York Jets, and despite Buffalo being on the road, they're still nearly 13-point favorites in a matchup that's projected to score nearly 48 points. There are several wide receivers that many of us will be starting in this matchup, and starting with the New York Jets. On that side of the ball, there really are only 2. Jamison Crowder, of course, and also Elijah Moore, who's coming off of his best game of the season. Not only did the rookie score his first touchdown, he actually scored 2. On top of that, he also put together the most amount of receiving yards he had posted in this season, while also tying his season high in targets as well. One thing to keep in mind though is that the backup to the backup was actually the quarterback that Elijah Moore played with for the most part of last game. So even though he does have the hottest hand, that doesn't necessarily mean it will translate week over week. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is that his first touchdown did come at the hands of Mike White. That touchdown pass coming on the first drive, the only drive that Mike White was unfortunately able to play before going down with an injury and holding him out for the remainder of the game. Considering most of Elijah Moore's production did come with the third-string quarterback, if I'm given the choice of starting either Jamison Crowder or Elijah Moore, unfortunately I do have to take the side of Crowder. He's just been so safe and consistent from a volume perspective regardless of who's starting at quarterback. He's received 6 or more targets in every game since week 4. And don't get me wrong though, they're not miles apart. We have both of them listed as flex plays this week, so outside the top 36, within the top 60. But if given the choice, I'd side with the safety of Jamison Crowder over the ceiling of Elijah Moore. There's no other receiver for New York that I'm considering starting in this matchup, so we'll move over to the Buffalo Bills. Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, Emmanuel Sanders. Diggs, of course, is a locked and loaded wide receiver one of the highest floor wide receivers who hasn't busted in several weeks now and is unlikely to bust in this matchup, so start him with confidence. One thing you'll notice though is that we did actually put Cole Beasley ahead of Emmanuel Sanders for the first time this season. And simply put, Emmanuel Sanders, he has not been producing over the past few weeks. Meanwhile, Cole Beasley has been playing lights out, and with a lot of the production for Emmanuel Sanders coming in the touchdown department, it's an area he could see increased competition from when it comes to Dawson Knox, who could potentially return to the field this week. Regardless of whether Dawson Knox returns or not, we do have both ranked within the top 36 this week, so good starts nonetheless. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on the road against the Washington football team. Washington in this one is coming off their bye, presumably more healthy. They do have a lot of injured pieces, including Logan Thomas, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Curtis Samuel, Antonio Gibson. The list goes on and on. When it comes to the receivers though, Logan Thomas, Curtis Samuel, neither one of them expected to suit up, and while Ryan Fitzpatrick, we will have to continue to wait for him. Either way though, this matchup is extremely juicy, so Terry McLaurin and Taylor Heineke, I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if the combo put together one of their best games of the season. With them being nearly double-digit point underdogs, they will be forced to be pushing the ball down the field in all 4 quarters. And with Tampa Bay's poor pass defense against opposing wide receivers, coupled with the lack of options that Washington has to throw to, and all that adds up to is an extremely high ceiling for Terry McLaurin this week. And although he may not necessarily hit that ceiling, and we do have him ranked as a wide receiver too, he'll come into this week with arguably the most upside he's had heading into any game this season. Nobody else for Washington at the wide receiver position we're considering starting, so moving over to Tampa Bay. Antonio Brown, as we know, this week did get out of his walking boot. However, he has already been ruled out for this Week 10 matchup. And considering it is against the team that's allowed the second most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are going to be incredible starts once again this week. On the graphic, you'll see that we do have Mike Evans listed ahead of Chris Godwin. Mike Evans, the high upside wide receiver 1. And although you may see that Chris Godwin is ranked as a wide receiver 2, he is an extremely high-end wide receiver 2, someone within that wide receiver 13 or 14 range, so virtually a back-end wide receiver 1 himself. Both players in this one will have a pretty high ceiling. Of course, Mike Evans a bit higher than that of Chris Godwin. The reason that he does rank ahead of him this week, just enjoy it while it lasts, because we all know as soon as Antonio Brown returns, either one of these two receivers could be the odd man out in this passing offense, posting a dud in any given week moving forward. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Atlanta Falcons versus the Dallas Cowboys. This game has an extremely high total of nearly 55 points. On the week, it's the highest of the season. Dallas, of course, 8-point home favorites. On the Dallas side of the ball, the big news here is Michael Gallup. He is going to be returning. And although we don't have him listed as a starter, he is outside of the top 60 for us, so not even in flex consideration. I know some of you may be in a tight spot to which you may be forced to start Michael Gallup. Maybe you have players on bye or injuries that you just have to fill into your roster. But us personally, we would prefer to take a wait-and-see approach because we don't know if he's going to play on a full amount of snaps. And with Cedric Wilson already on the season proving to be more than capable in his absence, so the Dallas coaching staff, they're not going to be extremely motivated in forcing Michael Gallup into playing on a high amount of snaps in what's going to be his first game back since week 1. They're of course expected to dominate Atlanta as it is. Both CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, they're coming into this one with an extremely high ceiling, and while I know neither player has really brought a high floor into any matchup, I do think if there was any matchup to trust these two receivers not to bust, a matchup against Atlanta with the highest projected total would definitely be the one to trust them. But you don't need me to tell you, if you own them, you're starting them. They've been auto starts all season long. Amari Cooper, more of a mid-grade wide receiver 2. CeeDee Lamb, a mid to back-end wide receiver 1. For Atlanta, this is where things get a bit tricky. This is going to be an area where some of you players could potentially hunt on the waiver wire. We have Russell Gage, Tajay Sharp, also Zacius, who's been producing very well as a big play receiver for this team. And with Matt Ryan coming off of one of his best performances of the entire season, there is a lot to be hopeful for in a matchup against Dallas, a team that allows a ton of production to opposing offenses. So I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if one of these three receivers was even able to crack the top 25 this week. Obviously, out of the three, Russell Gage, he's the easiest to trust. Zacius being the second best option just due to his home run hit ability. Those players that only need one play to produce are the type that I like to put in my flex. As for Tajay Sharp though, even though this is a juicy matchup, I would prefer to leave him on the bench, or better yet, leave him on the waiver wire. Alright guys, moving into the next matchup, we have the Indianapolis Colts versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The great thing about this matchup is that both teams have a pretty weak pass defense, meaning there's a good chance that any wide receiver you start that's in this matchup has a pretty solid chance of returning fantasy value for your lineup. Starting with Indianapolis, the premier option of course, Michael Pittman, who is now a wide receiver 1 on the season. He doesn't look as though he's slowing down whatsoever, and with Carson Wentz coming off of one of his best performances last week, Michael Pittman, far and away the top target in this offense. I think you could safely trust him as a wide receiver 2, but he clearly will have wide receiver 1 upside. My only concern is how easily beatable this Jacksonville Jaguars pass defense is. They simply may not need Michael Pittman as much as they did in the more difficult matchups, which could ultimately lead to more opportunities for the other receivers in this offense. The most likely candidate to soak up that lost production would of course be Zach Pascal, who has had 6 or more targets in each of the last 3 contests. And if that volume does hold for one more week against Jacksonville, it's more than enough to get it done against this porous pass defense, so long as you don't start him as anything more than a flex. As for T.Y. Hilton, I would prefer to leave him on the bench, not because of a lack of talent. Obviously, if he was fully healthy or in 2018 form, he would undoubtedly have wide receiver 1 upside against Jacksonville, who consistently allows big plays against every opponent. With that said, we still can't trust him to play in a full game. We don't know for certain if he's going to just be cleared to play and be on potentially a snap count, maybe even entering the game and exiting early. Either one of those could completely decimate your lineup, and I don't think his upside coming back from an injury more than makes up for the potential risk. As for Jacksonville, Marvin Jones, Laviska Shenault, and Jamal Agnew all have startability this week. Jones, of course, a top 36 option in this one, a tier ahead of the other 2 receivers, but when it comes to Laviska and Jamal Agnew, if given the choice, you almost have to side with the production, and Jamal Agnew simply has been outproducing Laviska lately, so if I am forced to only choose one of the 2, obviously I'd go with Agnew, but I do think you can start both of them in the flex, and they should provide you a similar amount of production. The next matchup we have is the Tennessee Titans versus the New Orleans Saints, and while the other matchups leading into this one have all been really weak pass defenses, that's not something we can necessarily rely on for either of these 2 defenses heading into Week 10. Both defenses performing as polar opposites. Tennessee, to begin the season, was one of the worst pass defenses in the league and currently still has allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the year. But if you followed any of the Tennessee Titans games over the last few weeks, Tennessee's defense has been playing out of their mind, meaning we can't head into this one thinking the New Orleans Saints have a cake matchup in the passing game. Then when it comes to the New Orleans pass defense, as mentioned, the virtual opposite. This was a team that started off extremely hot at defending wide receivers. Now they've been one of the fastest dropping, currently ranking now 6th at allowing fantasy points to wideouts. So when it comes to A.J. Brown and Julio Jones, each one of them, regardless of it sounding like a good matchup on paper, are going to have plenty of upside in this matchup. A.J. Brown, of course, a wide receiver 1. Julio Jones, a player you should only trust in the flex. He's really only been posting single-digit fantasy performances all season long, so regardless of the amount of upside he could potentially have, we have to go with the large sample on this one. But outside of those 2, we're not starting any other Tennessee receiver. On the other side of the ball, though, I think 2 of the 3 receivers you could potentially consider starting if you're really desperate, maybe 3. Obviously, of the 3, Marquez Callaway being the safest of the bunch, a player who's received 5+ targets in each of the past 4 games. Also, a player who's scored 4 receiving touchdowns in the past 6 weeks as well. Just keep in mind, over the past 3 weeks, he's been unable to eclipse 32 receiving yards, so when it comes to a floor, that's really not something we can guarantee, despite this being a really great matchup for wide receivers. Behind him, though, we still believe you can have faith in Deontay Harris, a player who's actually been outproducing Marquez Callaway when it comes to yardage and overall volume. 7 targets in Week 8, 8 targets in Week 9, while also posting more receiving yards in each of those 2 matchups that Marquez Callaway has posted over each of his past 3 games. If you're super desperate, Traquan Smith could be potentially a player you pick up off the waiver wire and thrust into your lineup. I don't think he's too far off of these other 2 wide receivers. However, if I did have to make a bet of which of the 3 wide receivers would score the least fantasy points in Week 10, I'd definitely choose him last. But if Tennessee's defense looks anything like it did through the first half of the season, there's a chance that all 3 receivers do pay dividends for anyone starting them. The next matchup we have is the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Detroit Lions. Pittsburgh is going to be at home in this one, and they are nearly 8-point favorites in a game that has one of the lowest totals of the week, coming in at 42.5 points. The big news on the Pittsburgh side is that Chase Claypool, he is injured, currently listed as week to week. And while he may be back for the fantasy playoffs, he's not going to be back in this week, already having been ruled out. And with the team having already been without Juju Smith-Schuster for the past several weeks, that's going to leave Deontay Johnson and James Washington to pick up most of that receiving production left behind. All this does, though, is just increases the floor of Deontay Johnson. But when it comes to Johnson, we already know he has one of the safest floors at the wide receiver position already. While it will also theoretically increase his ceiling, I doubt we actually see that ceiling because we're going to see increased usage from the tight ends, Pat Freiermuth, Eric Ebron, who should be returning this week as well. So however many times this declining offense does end up making it down to the end zone, we know that the tight ends who have a bigger frame, they would of course be the more ideal targets in this area of the field, which may ultimately impact Deontay Johnson's ability to actually reach that ceiling. Regardless though, we do have Deontay ranked as a wide receiver 1, and he will undoubtedly come into this matchup with a higher ceiling and floor. So if you own him, get him in your lineup, and James Washington is a player you can find off waivers who is almost guaranteed to get some volume this week just due to the lack of overall options in the Pittsburgh passing game. On the other side of the ball for Detroit, not much really does need to be said about either of these two receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Khalif Raymond, both players that you could trust in your flex position. Just keep in mind they are low-tier flex players, and when it comes to which players we do classify as flex, our standards aren't very high. It's going to include any player in the top 60. With many wide receivers out with injury or on bye, the bar for flex players, it's not all that high. And when it comes to these Detroit receivers, both of them I would still consider low-tier flexes. Moving into the next matchup, we have an interesting one. It's the New England Patriots on the road against the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland coming into this one as 2.5-point home favorites, but with Cleveland being without their top two running backs, Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, they may have to rely on the receiver position a bit more than they would like. Meaning Jarvis Landry, Donovan Peoples-Jones, we do think that they make solid starts this week. I understand that the matchup against the New England Patriots is not all that ideal, but we do know in order to move the ball between the 20s, they may have to rely on the sure hands of Jarvis Landry. And without Nick Chubb to break away for big plays in the run game, or without Kareem Hunt to potentially open up that short passing game, they may have to rely on these two wide receivers more than they have in previous matchups. For that, we do have Jarvis Landry ranked as a wide receiver 2, albeit a back-end one, somebody you would likely more trust as a high-end wide receiver 3. And Donovan Peoples-Jones, somebody who we do have ranked just inside the top 36, but that makes him a wide receiver 3 as well. I wouldn't go as far as to trusting Higgins, but on the New England side of things, Jacoby Myers each and every week, he's one of the most safe and consistent wide receiver 3s you could possibly ask for. I don't think you'll win a championship with Jacoby Myers if he can never reach the end zone, but if you ever need a player to put up around 10 points, somebody that you can trust not to bust, I don't think you ever have to look any further than Jacoby Myers. Believe it or not, Cleveland is not going to be the only team, possibly without running backs. There's a chance that this team will be without both Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson. If that does ultimately happen, we know this team is going to likely more heavily rely on the passing game, which means I do think both Kendrick Bourne and Nelson Aguilar, I believe they're both two players that you could put in the flex if you're in a desperate situation, dealing with injuries or potentially buys. Moving into a more exciting matchup with fantasy superstars, we have the LA Chargers versus the Minnesota Vikings. On the LA side of things, we have Mike Williams, Keenan Allen. I know Mike Williams did start the season as the hottest receiver in LA, but over the past several weeks, Keenan Allen definitely has been outproducing him. Mike Williams nearly hitting rock bottom, posting single-digit fantasy performances in each of the past 3 weeks. Well, if there was a matchup for him to get it together, I definitely think it would be against the Minnesota Vikings, who on the season have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to wideouts. And while a vintage 20-plus point performance may not necessarily be in the cards for Mike Williams this week, I wouldn't use that as a reason to leave him on the bench and potentially miss out on that top-tier production. Keenan Allen, as mentioned, a wide receiver 1, a high-floor option, but somebody that definitely has a relatively high ceiling as well. We saw him score over 20 fantasy points for the first time last week. And if the recent connection with Keenan Allen and Justin Herbert is any indication of how both are going to perform from this point forward, then Keenan Allen has to be an auto start each and every week, regardless of matchup. Thankfully, though, this is a premier matchup. Not the same thing can be said on the other side of the ball for Minnesota. The LA Chargers definitely have a more stingy pass defense when compared to their run defense, which is very porous. So we do have to lower the ceiling and floor of both Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen, as we know, a player who does typically rely on touchdowns, but with this game coming in with one of the highest totals of the week, 52.5 points, that's not going to be a reason to scare me off of starting Adam Thielen in my wide receiver 3 slot. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Carolina Panthers on the road against the Arizona Cardinals. If you own any players in this game, I definitely recommend that you continue to monitor the health of the players heading into this week. DeAndre Hopkins, his availability has yet been confirmed. Rondale Moore, while he is questionable, we do feel as though he will play. Moore at least practicing this past week, whereas DeAndre Hopkins has not practiced at all last week. With this team needing to rely on Hopkins in the playoffs, I would definitely recommend sitting him. However, we do know if it were up to Hopkins, he would be on the field right this second. For that reason, we do have to make sure we're aware if Hopkins plays or not. If he doesn't, that means Christian Kirk is going to be in a prime position to produce. Carolina, it may not be an ideal matchup for Christian Kirk. The volume he'll be receiving with DeAndre Hopkins out of the lineup should more than make up for that. We have Kirk listed just inside the top 30. Of course, that is on the back of DeAndre Hopkins not playing. And while if I did own Hopkins, even if he did end up ultimately starting, I may be a bit apprehensive to start him if I did have better options. In looking at Rondale Moore and AJ Green, these are two players that you could definitely trust in your flex spot, especially if Hopkins is out of the lineup. I may sit Rondale Moore if Hopkins does play, just simply due to the fact that AJ Green is expected to return and Rondale Moore is already banged up as is. A tough matchup already for a player who's been a bit hit or miss on the season. I think I would leave him on the bench, but as it stands, if Hopkins is out of the lineup, I think both make solid flex plays. AJ Green right around that top 40 range, Rondale Moore just outside the top 50. And as for Carolina, this is also a situation we do have to continue to monitor because we're not exactly sure who is going to be starting at quarterback. It could be Cam Newton, who was re-signed to the team this week. The last time, of course, we saw Cam Newton, he didn't necessarily look like the best fantasy quarterback, and he definitely didn't help any of the fantasy weapons in his offense, so I would be a bit concerned and downgrade DJ Moore, player who's already been on a downswing himself. So our usual ranking of a mid to high-end wide receiver 2. In this one so far, we do have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2, even in what should be a beatable matchup. As for Robbie Anderson, we couldn't trust him regardless of who's starting at quarterback, so preferably don't even start him in the flex, but I could understand if you're desperate. I know he does have name value, and he's not the type of player to sit on the waiver wire all that long. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Denver Broncos. This game has a modest total, 45 points. Denver, they're the home team in this one, 2.5 point favorites. Starting with the Denver receivers, we have 3 potential starters. Believe it or not, all 3 even listed as flex plays or better. Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, as well as Tim Patrick. I can't say for certain I would be as confident in starting Tim Patrick had 4 teams not been on bye this week and had we not been dealing with so many injuries, but regardless, here we are, and quietly, Tim Patrick has been a top 36 wide receiver on the season. I know Jerry Jeudy was not around for the majority of that, and since Jerry Jeudy's been back, the team has been getting him creatively involved, even now outproducing Courtland Sutton. So those of you that do own Jeudy, start him as a wide receiver 2. Just keep in mind it's more of a back-end wide receiver 2, somebody just inside the top 25 as opposed to a borderline top 12 player, which would be a high-end wide receiver 2. But either way, his involvement in the offense does give him a relatively high floor in this matchup. Can't say the same for Courtland Sutton and Tim Patrick. Sutton, a player who's been producing single-digit fantasy points, but in this one, he should have a very good chance to bounce back. We, of course, have downgraded him to a wide receiver 3, an area and range in which he will likely rank for the next few weeks until his involvement in the offense either increases or he continues to produce single-digit fantasy days, in which case we'll likely have to recommend you just leave him on the bench. We know he's talented, though. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt. If there is an odd man out, Tim Patrick would definitely be my choice, so although we do have him listed as a flex in other weeks, he may not have made the cut. On the other side of the ball, for the Philadelphia Eagles, it couldn't get any more simple. On this team, we're really starting Devontae Smith, not considering Jalen Reagor, a player who has received 2 or less targets in the majority of his recent games. Nowhere near enough volume for us to trust him. Even Quintez Watkins, a player who is a bit more involved in this passing game, he sees a high of 5 targets in good games. So any of you Watkins owners, just be aware that he could easily bust, and in a matchup against the Denver Broncos, I really don't think his potential upside would make up for that. As for Devonta Smith, I know we have him listed as a wide receiver 3, but he is basically one of the highest wide receiver 3s we have on the week, ranked inside the top 30. He's also coming off of his best game of the season, so if he's able to continue that production in this matchup that's less than ideal, then moving forward, we will take him more seriously in the rankings. The next matchup is the Green Bay Packers versus the Seattle Seahawks. In this game, we get the return of both Aaron Rodgers as well as Russell Wilson, which bodes really well for all of the receivers in this matchup. On the Green Bay side, we know we're starting Davante Adams each and every week, no questions asked. He hardly ever lets us down, if ever. But if we're looking for weapons in the Green Bay passing game outside of Davante Adams, really the only other possible option would be Randall Cobb, but even then, you would have to be in a really desperate situation. Yes, I know Aaron Rodgers is back and in some matchups has favored Randall Cobb, but I don't think this would be one of those matchups. Seattle, we're not exactly sure how strong their passing offense will even be with Russell Wilson returning from his own injury. Will they rely more on the run game? That's more than likely. But to both teams' credit, the projected total is relatively high, coming in at 49.5 points. And speaking of Seattle, with Russell Wilson now returning, that means DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, starting them each and every week is going to be that much easier. I know DK Metcalf produced fairly well in the absence of Russell Wilson, but Tyler Lockett not so much. Don't forget, though, that Lockett didn't produce when Russell Wilson was in the lineup, but in Wilson's first week back, we expect that to change. Tyler Lockett, we do have ranked as the wide receiver 19 as of today. DK Metcalf now, of course, will have a ton more potential upside. We have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1 this week, and with 1 or 2 strong performances, he could possibly regain his top 5 wide receiver value. The next matchup we have is a divisional matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Las Vegas Raiders. When it comes to the Raiders, as we know, this team is without Henry Ruggs, and their solution was to sign Deshaun Jackson. Now, I do know they do play similar roles in offenses, so it should be a near-perfect fit. My only concern, of course, is with Deshaun Jackson's age and health. I know Deshaun Jackson is the shiny new toy, but if I did pick him up off the waiver wire, I don't think this would be the week that I would be interested in starting him. I would prefer to take a wait-and-see approach, so you'll see him and Zay Jones we do have listed as players to sit, but Hunter Renfrow, a player who has been producing consistently over the past several weeks, he once again will be a top 30 option and a player that definitely doesn't get enough credit for what he does on the field. As for Bryan Edwards, this is a player you could trust in the flex in this matchup against Kansas City, a team that's going to be pushing this team offensively. This could potentially be a breakout game for Bryan Edwards, and if he does pop off, that will likely lead to more opportunities in games moving forward. As for Kansas City, we already know, start Tyreek Hill. He's a bona fide wide receiver 1, a top 3 wide receiver in most every week, this one especially. The only other receiver to potentially start in this offense, Mecole Hardman. I'm only trusting him in the flex just due to the lack of other options available. Moving into the final matchup, we have an interesting one with the LA Rams versus the San Francisco 49ers. Starting with San Francisco, this is another team that's extremely easy to predict when it comes to their wide receiver position. You'll only have 2 wide receivers of note, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk. Both players who do seem to be relatively healthy at this point. Deebo Samuel even being removed from the injury report this week. A promising sign to his potential upside this week, and I know it's against the LA Rams, but so far DJ Samuel has proven to be matchup proof. So it's no surprise we do have Deebo ranked as a wide receiver 1 this week. As for Ayuk, I couldn't be more thrilled that he has now posted 2 good games, back-to-back solid production, even coming off of one of his best performances of the season last week, a game in which he did only see 8 targets, but either way he made the most of it, and moving forward, I will continue to trust him, even going further than trusting him as just a flex player. This week, even in what's a difficult matchup, we'll have him ranked just outside the top 30. When it comes to LA, the big news, of course, is Odell Beckham Jr. is now on the team. He's also traveling with them and could potentially see some field time this week. And I know that scares a lot of owners of both Robert Woods as well as Cooper Kupp. Me personally, though, I do believe that there is enough volume to go around for both Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp to see a similar amount of production and volume, at least similar to what they were seeing at the first half of the season. Don't forget, Van Jefferson has been averaging 7 targets over the last 3 contests. There are many ways for Odell to get integrated into the offense and receive targets that may not necessarily be detrimental to any of the receivers producing for your team. Yes, Robert Woods may not be a top 20 wide receiver anymore. He may be more of a top 30 wide receiver, but I don't think you should be selling him for pennies on the dollar. And Cooper Kupp could still easily finish as the #1 wide receiver in fantasy, because that connection between Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, you can't just make that overnight regardless of what receiver you add to the team. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching.